Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The card paradox. Imagine a card, simple and rectangular, lying flat on a table, and on one side is written a single sentence. The statement on the other side of this card is true, and already the mind begins to sense danger, a trap being set. The card is flipped over, and on the reverse side another sentence appears. The statement on the other side of this card is false, and now the contradiction is complete. A perfect loop of mutual negation that cannot be resolved no matter how many times the card is turned. If the first side is true, then the second side must be true, as the first side claims, but if the second side is true, then the first side must be false, as the second side claims, which contradicts the assumption that the first side is true. And if the first side is false, then the second side must be false, as the first side incorrectly claims it is true. But if the second side is false, then the first side must be true, as the second side incorrectly claims it is false, and the cycle spirals endlessly without rest. The card paradox is a variation of the liar paradox, but its physical form makes the contradiction feel more tangible, more concrete, a paradox that can be held in the hand and turned over and over, as if repetition might somehow reveal a hidden answer that logic cannot provide. The paradox demonstrates how self-reference can be distributed across multiple statements rather than contained in a single sentence, showing that contradictions do not need to be immediate or obvious to be genuine, that they can emerge from relationships between statements rather than from the statements themselves. Philip Jourdan, a mathematician and logician, is often credited with popularizing this version of the paradox in the early 20th century, using it to explore the limits of truth and reference, and to illustrate the kinds of problems that plagued attempts to formalize logic and mathematics during that era. The card paradox also reveals something about the nature of truth itself, the way that truth is not a property that statements possess in isolation, but a relationship between statements and the world, or between statements and other statements. And when those relationships form closed loops, the concept of truth begins to break down. Some philosophers argue that the statements on the card are neither true nor false, but meaningless, that they fail to refer to anything outside themselves and therefore do not qualify as genuine propositions, while others suggest that the paradox exposes a flaw in the classical assumption that every statement must be either true or false, that perhaps some statements occupy a third category, undefined or indeterminate. The card sits on the table, innocent and menacing, a small object that contains an infinite problem, and no amount of flipping will resolve what is written on its surfaces. No clever interpretation will untangle the knot, and so it remains, a monument to the limits of language and logic, a reminder that not all questions have answers, that some truths are forever out of reach, caught in loops that reason cannot break. The boy or girl paradox. A family has two children, and you're told that at least one of them is a boy, and the question is posed, what is the probability that both children are boys? And the intuitive answer is 1/2, because the other child is either a boy or a girl with equal probability, but this reasoning is incorrect. The actual probability is 1/3, and this is the boy or girl paradox, a puzzle in conditional probability that has generated confusion and debate for decades, with different versions yielding different answers depending on exactly how the information is obtained and what assumptions are made about the selection process. The solution proceeds by considering all possible equally likely combinations of two children. There are 4 possibilities: boy-boy, boy-girl, girl-boy, girl-girl and girl-girl, where the order matters because the first child and second child are distinct even if both are boys or both are girls. And if we are told that at least one child is a boy, then the girl-girl possibility is eliminated, leaving three equally likely cases: boy-boy, boy-girl, and girl-boy. And only in one of these three cases are both children boys, and so the probability is 1/3, not 1/2. The paradox arises because the conditioning statement, at least one is a boy, is not the same as knowing the gender of a specific child. If instead we are told that the older child is a boy or the younger child is a boy, then the probability that both are boys becomes 1/2, because we are conditioning on a specific child being a boy rather than on the existential claim that at least one child somewhere in the family is a boy. And this distinction, subtle as it seems, makes a crucial difference to the probability calculation. The boy or girl paradox has many variations that probe the boundaries of the problem and reveal how sensitive the answer is to the exact specification of the scenario. One famous variant involves meeting a man who says he has 2 children, and one of them is a boy named Tuesday, meaning the boy was born on a Tuesday, and this additional information about the day of the week changes the probabilities in a surprising way, because it reduces the number of scenarios consistent with the statement, and the probability that both children are boys increases from 1/3 to 13/27. And this result seems bizarre, seems like the day of the week should be irrelevant, but the mathematics is sound. The additional specificity affects the conditional probabilities. Another variation asks, what if you meet a man with 2 children, and you see one of them, a boy? Does this change the answer? And the answer is yes. Seeing a specific boy is different from being told that at least one child is a boy, because seeing introduces selection effects. You are more likely to see a boy in families with 2 boys than in families with 1 boy, and so the probability calculation must account for the process by which the information was obtained, and different processes lead to different answers. And this sensitivity to selection effects is a general feature of conditional probability problems, and it explains why the boy or girl paradox has multiple defensible answers depending on the scenario. The paradox connects to the reference class problem and to debates about the principle of indifference, because applying the principle of indifference requires specifying a reference class, a set of equally likely outcomes, and different choices of reference class lead to different probability assignments. And in the boy or girl paradox, the reference class could be families with at least 1 boy, or it could be situations where someone tells you that at least one child is a boy. And these are different reference classes with different probabilities. And there is no neutral or obvious way to choose between them without more information about how the scenario is set up. The paradox also raises questions about the interpretation of probability statements in natural language, because phrases like "at least one is a boy" can be interpreted in different ways, as a statement about the existence of a boy in the family, as a statement about what someone knows or has observed, or as a statement about what information has been communicated, and each interpretation leads to different formal models and different probability calculations. And this ambiguity in natural language is a source of many probability paradoxes, where the mathematical answer depends on details that are not fully specified in the informal statement of the problem. Bayesian statisticians and frequentists also interpret the paradox differently. Bayesians treat probability as degrees of belief and calculate conditional probabilities using Bayes' theorem, while frequentists treat probability as long-run frequencies and may question whether the conditional probability is well defined without specifying a clear sampling procedure. And these different philosophical approaches to probability lead to different emphases in how the paradox is understood and resolved, though both traditions agree on the mathematical calculations once the problem is precisely formulated. The boy or girl paradox has practical analogues in genetics and medicine, where the probability of certain conditions depends on family history in ways that are similar to the structure of the paradox. For instance, the probability that a family carries a recessive genetic trait depends on how many children are observed to have the trait, and the calculations must account for ascertainment bias, the fact that families are more likely to come to medical attention if they have affected children, and this bias affects the probability assessments in ways that parallel the selection effects in the boy or girl paradox. The family walks down the street, 2 children beside them, and you know that at least one is a boy, and the question remains, what is the probability that both are boys? And the answer depends on how you came to know this fact, on whether you asked about a specific child or about any child, on whether you saw a boy or were merely told that at least one exists, and each variation of the scenario changes the answer, shifts the probabilities, reveals that conditional probability is sensitive to context, to process, to the mechanisms by which information is acquired and communicated, and the paradox persists as a puzzle, as a teaching tool, as a demonstration of how subtle probability can be, how carefully problems must be formulated, how easily intuition can mislead. And the boy walks ahead, evidence of his existence, shifting probabilities, conditioning beliefs, and the mathematics unfolds, precise and unforgiving, calculating 1/3 or 1/2 or 13/27, depending on the details, and the intuition struggles to keep up, struggles to grasp why the day of the week matters, why seeing is different from being told, why reference classes and selection effects have such profound impacts on what should be simple questions, and the paradox endures, unsettled in the sense that people continue to disagree about which answer is correct for which version, continue to debate whether the problem is well posed, continue to find new variations that test the boundaries of conditional probability, and the family continues walking. The boy or boys or boy and girl continue existing, and the question remains open, answerable only when the scenario is specified with enough precision to eliminate ambiguity, to fix the reference class, to determine the selection process, and until then, the paradox lives on. A reminder that probability is not just mathematics, but interpretation. Not just calculation, but careful attention to how information is obtained, how questions are asked, and how evidence is generated. The binding problem: how your brain unites what it processes separately. A neuroscientist examines how the brain processes visual information, discovers that different features of objects are processed in different brain regions. Color is processed in one area, motion in another, shape in a third, orientation in a fourth, and all these features are analyzed separately, by specialized modules, by distinct populations of neurons. And yet when you look at a red ball moving to the right, you do not experience color, motion, and shape as separate. Do not see redness here and roundness there and rightward motion elsewhere, but see a unified object, a red round ball moving right, and all the features are bound together, are experienced as properties of a single thing. And this creates the binding problem, the puzzle of how the brain, which processes features separately, creates unified conscious experiences, how separate neural processes give rise to integrated perception, how the many become one. And this problem is fundamental, touches on the nature of consciousness, on how neural activity becomes experience, on what unifies experience into coherent wholes, and no complete solution exists. Various theories have been proposed, but the binding problem remains one of the deep mysteries of neuroscience, a gap between our understanding of neural processing and our understanding of consciousness. Imagine the visual system as a factory, with different departments processing different aspects of the product. One department handles color, another handles shape, another handles location, and all work in parallel, all process simultaneously, and each department produces its output color information, shape information, location information, and somehow these separate outputs must be combined, must be integrated into a unified representation, must be bound together so that you experience a red ball rather than redness and roundness as separate unlocalized features. And the binding problem asks how this combination occurs. What mechanism ensures that the right features are bound together? That the redness is attributed to the round object and not to the square object that happens to be present in the scene. And this correct attribution, this accurate binding, is critical for coherent perception, for navigating the world successfully, and yet how the brain achieves it remains unclear. The binding problem has two aspects: the feature binding problem, which asks how different features of the same object are bound together, and the object binding problem, which asks how different objects are kept separate, are not confused with each other, and both aspects are challenging. Both reveal that perceptual unity is not given automatically by neural processing, but requires some mechanism, some process that groups features appropriately, and various mechanisms have been proposed. Attention has been suggested as a solution. The idea that attention binds features, that attended objects have their features integrated, while unattended objects do not. And this explains why feature binding errors occur when attention is diverted, why illusory conjunctions occur where features from different objects are misbound, are attributed incorrectly. Visualize attention as a spotlight that illuminates objects one at a time, and within the spotlight features are bound, are integrated, and outside the spotlight features remain separate, are not integrated, and this attentional binding theory has some support, has experimental evidence showing that feature binding requires attention, that without attention, features can be perceived separately without being bound correctly, and illusory conjunctions are more common under conditions of inattention, supporting the idea that attention is necessary for binding. But attention cannot be the complete solution, because some binding occurs pre-attentively. Some feature integration happens automatically before attention is applied, and so attention is part of the story, but not the whole story. Another proposed mechanism is temporal synchrony, the idea that neurons representing features of the same object fire in synchrony, fire together, and this synchrony is the binding code, is what marks features as belonging together and neurons representing different objects. Fire at different times or with different phases, and this temporal separation keeps objects distinct, prevents their features from being bound together. And this synchrony theory has been influential, has generated extensive research, has led to discovery of synchronized neural oscillations in visual cortex, but the theory faces challenges. It is not clear that synchrony is sufficient for binding, it is not clear that consciousness depends on synchrony, and some experiments have failed to find the predicted correlations between synchrony and perceptual binding, and the theory remains controversial. A third approach argues that binding occurs through convergence, through hierarchical processing, where features are combined in higher-level areas, and early visual areas process features separately, but project to higher areas that represent combinations, that have neurons responding to specific conjunctions of features. And these conjunction neurons represent bound objects, represent integrated wholes, and binding is achieved through this hierarchical architecture, through neurons that explicitly encode feature combinations. And this approach has support from single neuron recordings showing that higher visual areas have neurons with complex selectivity, neurons that respond to specific combinations of shape and color and motion, and these neurons could be the neural basis of bound object representations. The binding problem also connects to consciousness, because unified conscious experience seems to require binding, seems to require that separate neural processes be integrated into coherent wholes, and some theories of consciousness, like integrated information theory, make integration central, argue that consciousness arises from integrated information, from systems where different parts interact and constrain each other, and binding is a form of integration, is the combination of separately processed features into unified representations. And understanding binding may be crucial for understanding consciousness, may reveal how neural processes give rise to unified experience. The problem also has practical implications. For understanding neurological conditions where binding fails, where patients see features but cannot bind them correctly, and such conditions exist. Balint syndrome is one example, where patients can see individual features but cannot perceive objects, cannot integrate features into wholes. And these patients provide evidence that binding is a genuine process, is not automatic, can be disrupted by brain damage. And studying these patients helps understand normal binding, helps identify the brain regions and processes necessary for feature integration. Some philosophers argue that the binding problem is really a problem about consciousness, about how physical processes give rise to subjective experience, about the hard problem. And binding is one aspect of this, is the problem of how separate neural processes give rise to unified conscious experiences. And solving the binding problem may require solving the hard problem, may require understanding how neural activity becomes experience. And this makes binding one of the deepest problems in neuroscience, a problem at the interface between neuroscience and philosophy of mind. The brain processes features separately, colour here, motion there, shape elsewhere, and yet you see unified objects, see red round balls moving, see integrated wholes, and how this integration occurs, how the separate processes give rise to unified experiences, remains one of the great unsolved problems. The binding problem stands, challenging, fundamental, revealing a gap between our understanding of neural processing and our understanding of perception. And various theories exist, various mechanisms have been proposed. Attention, synchrony, convergence, but no theory is complete. No theory explains all aspects of binding, and the problem persists as one of neuroscience's deepest mysteries. A puzzle about how unity emerges from multiplicity, how the brain binds what it processes separately, and the question remains open. The mechanism remains elusive, and the binding problem endures. The coastline paradox, why no one can agree how long Britain's shore is. A mapmaker sits down to measure the length of the coastline of Great Britain, the perimeter of the island, the total distance around its shores. And this seems like a straightforward task, a matter of careful measurement and calculation. But the paradox is that the answer depends on the scale of measurement, on how closely you look, on what size ruler you use to trace the coast. And as the ruler gets smaller, as the measurement becomes more precise, the measured length increases without bound, growing larger and larger, approaching infinity. And so the coastline has no well-defined length, or rather, its length is infinite. Or rather, the question of length becomes meaningless for highly irregular shapes. And this is the coastline paradox, first articulated clearly by mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot, who used it to motivate the study of fractals, shapes that exhibit self-similarity and complexity at all scales. Imagine measuring the coastline with a 100-kilometre ruler, a straight stick 100 kilometres long, and you walk around the island placing the stick end to end, measuring each straight segment. And when you reach the starting point, you add up all the segments and get a total length, perhaps 4,000 kilometres, and this seems like a reasonable measurement. But now imagine using a 10-kilometre ruler instead, a shorter stick. And because the ruler is shorter, it can follow the bends and curves of the coast more closely. It does not cut across bays and headlands, but traces around them. And when you complete the circuit, the total length is longer, perhaps 5,000 kilometres, because the shorter ruler captures more detail, more twists and turns, that the longer ruler missed. And now imagine using a 1-kilometre ruler, even shorter, and it follows the coast even more closely, entering smaller inlets, tracing around individual rocks and peninsulas, and the measured length increases again, perhaps to 7,000 kilometres. Continue this process using shorter and shorter rulers, a 100-metre ruler, a 10-metre ruler, a 1-metre ruler, and each time the measured length increases, because each shorter ruler reveals new details, new irregularities, new ins and outs that the previous ruler smoothed over, and the coastline is fractal-like, exhibiting structure at every scale. Every time you zoom in, you find new complexity, new bays within bays, new peninsulas jutting from peninsulas. And so there is no scale at which the coast becomes smooth, no level of detail at which further refinement stops revealing new length. And if you continue to arbitrarily, small rulers, measuring every pebble, every grain of sand, every molecule, the measured length grows without limit, approaching infinity. And so the coastline paradox concludes that the coastline has infinite length, or more carefully, that the concept of length as traditionally defined does not apply to highly irregular curves like coastlines. Mandelbrot used this paradox to introduce fractals, geometric shapes characterized by self-similarity and non-integer dimension. And he showed that coastlines, along with many other natural shapes like clouds, mountains, rivers, and trees, are better described by fractal geometry than by traditional Euclidean geometry. And fractals have a property called fractal dimension, a number that quantifies how much space the shape fills. And for a smooth curve, the dimension is 1. For a surface, the dimension is 2. But for fractals, the dimension can be a non-integer, like 1.2 or 1.5, indicating that the shape is more than a line, but less than a surface. And coastlines typically have fractal dimensions between 1 and 2, reflecting their intricate, space-filling character. The paradox has practical implications for geography and cartography, because if coastline length depends on measurement scale, then different measurements will give different answers. And there is no single correct answer to the question, how long is the coastline of Great Britain? The answer depends on what resolution of map you use, on what level of detail you include, and different countries and agencies use different conventions, sometimes specifying a minimum feature size or a standard ruler length. But these conventions are arbitrary, and different conventions give different lengths. And so coastline length is not an intrinsic property of the coastline, but a relational property that depends on the measurement method. The paradox also raises philosophical questions about measurement and the nature of geometric properties, because it suggests that some shapes do not have well-defined lengths, that the concept of length, which works well for straight lines and smooth curves, breaks down for irregular shapes, and this is not a limitation of our measuring instruments, but a feature of the shapes themselves. And this raises the question of whether length is a fundamental property of all curves, or whether it is a concept that applies only to sufficiently regular curves. And fractals fall outside the domain where traditional geometric concepts apply. Visualize the coast as an infinitely jagged line, with bays and headlands at every scale. Zoom in on a section and you see smaller bays and headlands. Zoom in again and you see even smaller ones. And this pattern repeats forever. There is no smooth coastline at any level of magnification, only more and more detail. And so tracing the coast means following an infinitely intricate path. And the length of an infinitely intricate path is infinite. And this is the essence of the paradox, that complexity at all scales produces infinite length, that irregular shapes are fundamentally different from regular shapes, and that traditional geometry is inadequate to describe them. The coastline paradox also appears in other contexts, in measuring the length of borders between countries, in measuring the perimeter of cells or the surface area of lungs, both of which exhibit fractal-like structure with increasing detail at smaller scales. And in all these cases, the measured value depends on the scale of measurement, and there is no single correct answer, only a family of answers indexed by measurement resolution. And this multiplicity is not an error or a limitation, but a feature of the geometry, a reflection of the fact that irregular shapes do not have simple scalar properties like length or area in the traditional sense. The mapmaker gives up, unable to provide a single definitive number for the coastline length, or provides multiple numbers with caveats about measurement scale, and the coastline stretches around the island, infinitely detailed, infinitely long if measured with infinite precision, and the paradox remains a reminder that geometry is more complex than Euclid imagined, that natural shapes do not conform to circles and straight lines, that measurement depends on scale, and that some questions like how long is the coastline do not have simple answers, and Mandelbrot's fractals provide a framework for understanding this complexity, for describing and quantifying irregular shapes, and for recognizing that the world is full of structures that are neither one-dimensional nor two-dimensional, but somewhere in between. And the paradox endures, a touchstone in fractal geometry, a demonstration that infinity appears not just in abstract mathematics, but in concrete measurements of real physical objects, and the coastline remains, jagged and intricate, defying simple measurement, a natural fractal that reveals the limits of traditional geometry and the need for new mathematical tools to capture the complexity of the world. The blind sight paradox. Why some blind people can see without seeing. A patient suffers damage to the primary visual cortex, the region of the brain that processes visual information and produces conscious visual experience, and the damage is severe, destroys the tissue completely, and the patient reports being blind, reports seeing nothing, experiencing only darkness in the affected visual field, and vision tests confirm the blindness. The patient cannot identify objects placed in the blind region, cannot read letters, cannot describe colours or shapes, and by every standard clinical measure, the patient has lost vision in that part of their visual field. And yet something strange occurs. Experimenters place objects in the blind field and ask the patient to guess where they are, to point at them even though the patient cannot see them, and the patient protests, says this is pointless, says there is nothing to see, but when forced to guess, the patient points accurately, reaches correctly, identifies the location, and sometimes even the nature of objects at levels far above chance. And this ability, this capacity to respond to visual information without conscious visual experience is called blind sight, and it creates a paradox. The patient is both blind and not blind, both lacks vision and has vision, lacks conscious sight but retains unconscious visual processing. And this dissociation between conscious experience and information processing challenges our understanding of perception, challenges the relationship between consciousness and function, and raises questions about what vision is, whether seeing requires awareness, whether perception requires experience. And this is the blind sight paradox, a phenomenon that reveals that consciousness can be separated from processing, that the brain can use information without the person experiencing it. Imagine the blind sight patient's perspective, looking straight ahead, and part of the visual field is normal, contains conscious visual experience, objects and colours and shapes, and another part is blank, is darkness, is absence of experience, and experimenters place an object in the blind region, a ball perhaps, and ask where it is, and the patient says, I don't know, I can't see anything there. And the experimenter says, just guess. Point to where you think it is, and the patient reluctantly points, randomly it seems. And yet the pointing is accurate, is directed toward the ball, and the patient is surprised. Says it was just a lucky guess, has no feeling of seeing, no visual experience that guided the response, and yet the accuracy persists, trial after trial. And the paradox is that the patient is using visual information, is processing it, is responding to it, but is not conscious of it, is not experiencing it. And vision has split into two components, conscious experience and information processing. And these normally go together, but in blind sight they come apart. The blind sight phenomenon has been documented in multiple patients, studied extensively, and the mechanism involves intact pathways from the eye to brain regions outside the primary visual cortex. Pathways that process visual information for action and navigation without producing conscious experience. And these pathways allow blind sight patients to respond to visual stimuli without seeing them. And the existence of these pathways shows that vision is not a single unified process, but involves multiple systems, some conscious and some unconscious, and damage to visual cortex eliminates conscious vision, but leaves unconscious visual processing intact. And this dissociation reveals something fundamental about consciousness, shows that information processing is not sufficient for conscious experience, that the brain can process and use information without that information becoming conscious. Visualize vision as having multiple components. One component processes information for conscious perception, for seeing in the ordinary sense, for having visual experiences, and another component processes information for action, for guiding behavior, for spatial navigation. And normally these components work together, are integrated, and we do not notice the distinction. But in blind sight, they separate. One component is destroyed while the other remains, and the patient has action vision without perceptual vision, can use visual information for pointing and reaching, but cannot experience that information, cannot see it. And this shows that conscious experience is not simply a byproduct of information processing, but is a specific kind of processing, localized in specific brain regions. And when those regions are damaged, consciousness is lost even though other forms of visual processing continue. The blind sight paradox challenges functionalist theories of consciousness. Theories that say consciousness is defined by functional roles, by what information does, by how it affects behavior, because in blind sight, visual information performs many of its normal functions, guides behavior, enables responses, but does not produce conscious experience. And so consciousness is not identical to function, is something additional, is a specific kind of processing beyond mere responsiveness to stimuli. And this supports theories that distinguish between access consciousness, the availability of information for cognitive processes, and phenomenal consciousness, the subjective experiential quality. And blind sight shows that these can come apart, that information can be accessed and used without being phenomenally conscious. One response to the blind sight paradox accepts that it shows consciousness is separate from certain functions, from certain kinds of information processing, but argues that this does not threaten physicalism, does not show that consciousness is non-physical, only that it is a specific physical process localized in specific brain regions. And blind sight is a case where some visual processing continues without the processing that produces conscious experience, and this is compatible with consciousness being physical, being identical to certain patterns of neural activity. And the paradox shows which patterns are necessary for consciousness, shows that primary visual cortex is essential, and this is progress in understanding the neural correlates of consciousness. Another response questions whether blind sight patients truly lack conscious experience, argues that they might have degraded or partial visual experiences that they do not recognize as vision, that do not match their expectations of what seeing should feel like. And when they say they see nothing, they mean they have no clear, vivid visual experience, but they might have vague feelings, subtle impressions that guide their guesses, and these impressions might be minimal forms of consciousness rather than pure unconscious processing. And this response denies the complete dissociation, argues that some phenomenology remains in blind sight, even if it is not ordinary visual phenomenology. A third response embraces the paradox as revealing that consciousness is not necessary for many cognitive functions, that unconscious processing is far more powerful than we thought, that the mind operates largely without awareness and consciousness is only the tip of the iceberg, a small subset of mental processes. And blind sight is an extreme case, but similar dissociations occur in normal cognition, where we process information, make decisions, guide behavior without conscious awareness. And the paradox shows that consciousness, rather than being essential to cognition, is a specialized feature that occurs only in certain conditions, for certain kinds of information processing. The blind sight paradox also has implications for debates about animal consciousness, about which animals are conscious, because if information processing without consciousness is possible in humans, then it might be the norm in simpler animals. Animals might respond to stimuli, navigate environments, exhibit complex behaviors without having conscious experiences, without there being anything it is like to be them. And this makes determining animal consciousness more difficult, makes behavioral evidence insufficient, because behavior can be produced by unconscious processing, as blindsight demonstrates. The patient sits in the laboratory, the blind field tested again and again, and each time the accuracy surprises, the pointing succeeds, the guessing is correct, and the patient insists they see nothing, feel nothing, experience nothing in that region, and yet the information is there, is being used, is guiding behavior, and the paradox persists. Vision without seeing, processing without experience, function without phenomenology, and the blind sight paradox remains one of the most important phenomena in consciousness research. A real-world demonstration that conscious experience and information processing can dissociate, that the brain can use information the person does not consciously access, and that consciousness is not reducible to function, is something specific, something localized, something that can be lost while other aspects of vision remain. And the phenomenon continues to challenge theories of consciousness, continues to provide evidence about the neural basis of awareness, and continues to raise questions about what consciousness is, what purposes it serves, why it exists, and whether it is necessary for cognition or is instead a luxury, an addition, something that happens only when certain brain regions process information in certain ways, and the blindsight patient reaches into darkness and touches the object, accurate despite seeing nothing, and the paradox endures. The consequence argument, why the past makes your future inevitable. A philosopher constructs a deceptively simple argument about free will and determinism, an argument that has become one of the most influential and most discussed arguments in the free will debate. And the argument is called the consequence argument, formulated most clearly by Peter van Inwagen, and the argument aims to show that free will is incompatible with determinism, that if determinism is true, then no one has free will, that our actions are not genuinely up to us but are consequences of the past and the laws of nature, things we cannot control, and the argument proceeds through careful reasoning about what we can and cannot control, about what is and is not up to us, and it concludes that if the past and the laws determine everything, then we determine nothing. We have no control. We are not free. And this is the consequence argument, an argument for incompatibilism, for the view that determinism and free will cannot both be true, and the argument forces compatibilists to explain how we could be free if determinism is true, how our actions could be up to us if they are inevitable consequences of factors beyond our control, and the debate sparked by this argument continues, with philosophers proposing responses, defending premises, clarifying concepts, and the consequence argument remains central to contemporary discussions of free will, a challenge that every theory must address. Imagine the logical structure. Determinism says that the state of the world at any time, plus the laws of nature, entail the state of the world at all future times. Everything that happens is a consequence of what happened before, plus the laws. And now consider your action right now. Reading these words, and if determinism is true, then this action is entailed by the state of the world before you were born, plus the laws of nature, and you have no control over the state of the world before you were born. You did not cause it. You cannot change it. It is a fixed fact about the past, and you have no control over the laws of nature. You did not create them. You cannot alter them. They are what they are, independent of you. And if your action is entailed by things you have no control over, then you have no control over your action. And if you have no control over your action, then you are not free with respect to that action. And this applies to all your actions. All are consequences of the past and the laws, things beyond your control. And so if determinism is true, then you are not free. You have no free will. And this is the consequence argument in its essential form. The argument can be stated more formally using the concept of power, what we have power over, what is up to us. And the argument says that no one has power over the past, no one has power over the laws of nature, no one has power over the fact that the past and the laws entail the present. And therefore, by a transfer principle, if the present is entailed by things we have no power over, then we have no power over the present. And having power over our actions is necessary for free will, and so we lack free will. If determinism is true, and the argument is valid, the conclusion follows from the premises. And so attacking the argument requires attacking one of the premises, requires either denying that we lack power over the past and laws, which seems implausible, or denying the transfer principle, denying that lack of power transfers across entailment. Visualize the causal chain, stretching back into the past, the state of the universe billions of years ago, plus the laws of physics, determined the state 1 second later, and that state, plus the laws determined the next state. And the chain continues, moment by moment, through the formation of galaxies and stars and planets, through the evolution of life, through human history, through your birth and upbringing and this present moment. And at no point in this chain did you have control. You were not there at the beginning. You did not set the initial conditions. You did not write the laws, and the entire chain was set in motion before you existed. And your current action is the end of this chain, is the inevitable consequence of factors you did not control. And the consequence argument says, this shows you are not free. Your action was not genuinely up to you, was determined by the past. Compatibilists respond to the consequence argument in various ways. One response denies the transfer principle, argues that lack of power does not transfer across entailment in the way the argument assumes, that you can have power over a fact even if that fact is entailed by other facts you have no power over. And this response requires specifying what power means, what it is to have something be up to you. And compatibilists argue that an action is up to you if it results from your deliberation, your desires, your character, even if those psychological states were themselves determined by the past. And so the transfer principle is false. Power does not transfer, and the consequence argument fails. Another compatibilist response accepts the transfer principle, but denies that we lack power over the past in the relevant sense, argues that we do have a kind of counterfactual power over the past. We have the power such that if we had chosen differently, then the past would have been different. And this counterfactual power is sufficient for freedom, sufficient for the action to be up to us. And critics respond that counterfactual power is not real power, that being such that if you acted differently, the past would have been different is not the same as being able to act differently. And the compatibilist response confuses conditional ability with genuine ability, confuses what would have happened if things were different with what you can make happen. A third compatibilist response distinguishes between freedom and ultimate responsibility, accepts that the consequence argument shows we lack ultimate responsibility, ultimate control, the kind of control that would make us solely and completely responsible for our actions independent of all prior causes, but argues that we have enough control, enough freedom, for moral responsibility, for being proper subjects of praise and blame. And ultimate responsibility is impossible, is not required for the ordinary kind of responsibility that matters for ethics and law. And the consequence argument shows too much, shows that even libertarians who reject determinism cannot have ultimate responsibility because their actions are either caused by prior states or are random, and neither causation nor randomness gives ultimate responsibility. And so, the consequence argument does not distinguish between compatibilism and libertarianism, does not favour incompatibilism over compatibilism. Incompatibilists defend the consequence argument, defend the transfer principle, argue that compatibilist responses involve sophisticated verbal tricks, redefine freedom in ways that evacuate it of meaning, and the consequence argument reveals that if determinism is true, then we are not truly in control, are not genuinely free, and moral responsibility is undermined. and we must either reject determinism or accept that free will is an illusion, and different incompatibilists choose differently. Some become libertarians and argue that determinism is false, that quantum mechanics or agent causation or emergent properties provide room for free will, and others become hard determinists and accept that free will does not exist, that responsibility is problematic, that praise and blame need reinterpretation. The consequence argument also generates discussions about the fixity of the past, about what it means to say we have no power over the past. Because in one sense this is obvious. We cannot change what has already happened, cannot make it the case that the past was different. But in another sense, our current actions do affect what the past was, because if we act differently now, then the past must have been different given determinism. And so there is a sense in which our actions constrain the past, and compatibilists exploit this to argue that we do have power over the past in the relevant sense, while incompatibilists insist that this is not real power, not the kind of control required for freedom. The argument stands at the centre of free will debates, forces clarification of concepts, forces philosophers to specify what freedom requires, what control means, what power involves, and whether these are compatible with determinism, and the debate is productive, generates insight, even if it does not generate consensus, and the consequence argument remains one of the most powerful arguments for incompatibilism. One of the most difficult challenges for compatibilists to answer, and Van Inwagen's formulation is elegant, is compelling, captures a deep intuition that if everything we do is the inevitable consequence of factors beyond our control, then we are not truly free and the past stretches back, determined and fixed, and the laws operate, inexorable and unchanging, and the present unfolds and the action occurs, and the consequence argument says, this action was not free, was not genuinely up to the agent, was a consequence of things beyond control, and whether this argument succeeds, whether compatibilists can answer it, remains disputed, remains central to contemporary philosophy of free will. The Bertrand's box paradox. 3 identical boxes sit before you, each containing 2 coins. The first box contains 2 gold coins, the second box contains 2 silver coins, and the third box contains 1 gold coin and 1 silver coin. And you cannot see inside the boxes, cannot distinguish them from the outside, and a box is chosen at random and opened, and 1 coin is drawn from it, also at random, and the coin turns out to be gold. And now a question is posed that seems simple, but leads to surprising confusion. What is the probability that the other coin in the same box is also gold? And the intuitive answer that most people give is 1/2, reasoning that since the drawn coin is gold, the box cannot be the one with 2 silver coins. So it must be either the box with 2 gold coins or the box with 1 gold and 1 silver. And these 2 possibilities seem equally likely, and so the probability that the other coin is gold should be 1/2. But this reasoning is wrong. The correct answer is 2/3, and this is Bertrand's box paradox, named after Joseph Bertrand, who presented it in 1889, a puzzle in conditional probability that reveals how easily intuition misleads when reasoning about random processes and conditional information. The error in the intuitive reasoning lies in treating the 2 remaining boxes as equally likely, but they are not, because the probability calculation must account for how the gold coin was observed, must condition not just on which box was chosen, but on which coin was drawn. And the key insight is that there are 3 gold coins in total, 2 in the first box and 1 in the third box, and the drawn coin is equally likely to be any of these 3. And if the drawn coin is one of the 2 from the first box, then the other coin in the same box is also gold, while if the drawn coin is the one from the third box, then the other coin is silver. And since 2 of the 3 equally likely possibilities lead to the other coin being gold, the probability is 2/3, not 1/2. Another way to see the solution is to consider all possible outcomes. There are 6 coins in total, labelled gold 1 and gold 2 in the first box, silver 1 and silver 2 in the second box, and gold 3 and silver 3 in the third box, and each coin is equally likely to be the one drawn, and we're told that a gold coin was drawn, which eliminates silver 1, silver 2 and silver 3, leaving gold 1, gold 2 and gold 3 as equally probable. And if gold 1 was drawn, then the other coin in the same box is gold 2. If gold 2 was drawn, then the other coin is gold 1. And if gold 3 was drawn, then the other coin is silver 3. And so in 2 of the 3 cases, the other coin is gold, giving a probability of 2/3. The Bertrand box paradox is structurally similar to other probability puzzles, like the Monty Hall problem and the Three Prisoners problem, where conditioning on partial information updates probabilities in non-obvious ways, where the process by which information is revealed matters as much as the content of the information, and where naive intuition fails to properly account for the structure of the problem. And the paradox illustrates the importance of specifying the sample space carefully, of identifying all possible outcomes and their probabilities, and of using Bayes' theorem or other formal tools to update probabilities rather than relying on informal reasoning. The paradox also raises questions about the reference class problem, about which population of events the observed outcome should be considered a member of, because the intuitive error involves thinking of the outcome as selecting a box type, either 2 gold or mixed, rather than selecting a particular coin. And this shift in reference class changes the probabilities, and the correct solution requires identifying the right reference class, the set of all coins that could have been drawn, and calculating probabilities relative to that set. Bertrand's box paradox has pedagogical value. It is often used in teaching probability to illustrate conditional probability, to show how careful reasoning differs from intuitive judgment, and to demonstrate the value of systematic methods like constructing probability trees or using Bayes' theorem. And students who understand the paradox gain insight into a common class of errors that arise from failing to properly condition on all relevant information, from treating distinct events as equiprobable when they are not, and from confusing the probability of a hypothesis given evidence with the probability of evidence given a hypothesis. The paradox also appears in variations, sometimes with coloured balls instead of coins, sometimes with different numbers of boxes or different distributions, and each. Variation tests slightly different aspects of probabilistic reasoning, but the core lesson remains the same, that conditional probabilities must be calculated carefully, that intuition is unreliable, and that formal methods are necessary to avoid systematic errors. And the paradox connects to real-world situations where similar reasoning is required. Medical diagnosis, where symptoms must be interpreted in light of disease prevalence and test reliability. Legal reasoning, where evidence must be weighed in light of prior probabilities and alternative explanations. And machine learning, where classifiers must be trained to properly account for base rates and conditional dependencies. The boxes sit on the table, indistinguishable from the outside. The gold coin gleams in your hand, and the question hangs in the air: what is the probability that the other coin is also gold? And the answer, 2/3, contradicts the intuitive 1/2, and the gap between intuition and mathematics reveals something about how we reason about chance, about how we estimate probabilities, about how we update beliefs in light of evidence. And the Bertrand box paradox remains a touchstone, a simple puzzle with a surprising answer, a demonstration that probability is subtle, that conditioning changes things in non-obvious ways, and that even questions that seem straightforward can hide complexity, can require careful analysis to answer correctly. And the paradox endures as a teaching tool, a cautionary tale, a reminder that mathematical reasoning is necessary to avoid errors that intuition cannot prevent. And the gold coin sits there, evidence that shifts probabilities, information that updates beliefs, and the calculation proceeds, formal and precise, yielding 2/3, and the intuition retreats, humbled by mathematics, corrected by careful thought, and the lesson is learned again. That probability is counterintuitive, that conditional reasoning is hard, and that paradoxes like Bertrand's box serve an essential function, exposing the gaps between how we think we reason and how we actually should reason, between the quick judgments of intuition and the slow calculations of mathematics. And the boxes remain coins inside, waiting to teach the next student, to confound the next intuition, to reveal once more that chance and evidence interact in ways that defy expectation. And the paradox persists, elegant and instructive, a permanent fixture in the pedagogy of probability, a puzzle that generations of students have encountered and been surprised by, and will continue to encounter as long as probability is taught and intuition needs correction. The Banach-Tarski paradox. A solid sphere can be decomposed into a finite number of pieces, which can then be reassembled using only rotations and translations to form two solid spheres, each identical to the original. And this seems to violate conservation of volume, seems to create matter from nothing, seems to be impossible, and yet it is a theorem in mathematics, proven rigorously using the axiom of choice and the properties of infinite point sets. And this is the Banach-Tarski paradox, named after Stefan Banach and Alfred Tarski, who proved it in 1924. And the paradox reveals deep and counterintuitive features of infinite decompositions, of non-measurable sets, and of the relationship between mathematics and physical reality. The proof proceeds by decomposing the sphere into a finite number of pieces, typically 5 or 6, and each piece is a set of points, not a solid region with smooth boundaries, but a scattered, disconnected, infinitely complex collection of points. And these pieces are non-measurable, meaning they do not have well-defined volumes in the usual sense. They cannot be assigned a size using standard measure theory. And this is crucial because measurable sets cannot be duplicated. Conservation of volume holds for measurable sets, but non-measurable sets escape this constraint. They can be rearranged in ways that seem to violate intuition, and the Banach-Tarski paradox exploits this by constructing pieces that are so pathological, so wildly scattered, that they can be rotated and translated to form two complete spheres. The decomposition uses the axiom of choice, the principle that given any collection of non-empty sets, there exists a way to choose one element from each set, and the axiom of choice is independent of the other axioms of set theory. It cannot be proven or disproven from the standard axioms, and some mathematicians reject it precisely because it leads to results, like the Banach-Tarski paradox, results that seem absurd, and rejecting the axiom of choice avoids the paradox. But it also cripples large parts of modern mathematics. Many important theorems depend on the axiom of choice, and most mathematicians accept it despite its counterintuitive consequences. The paradox applies only to objects in 3-dimensional space, or higher. It does not work in 2 dimensions. A disk cannot be decomposed and reassembled into 2 disks. And this is because the group of rotations in the plane is amenable, meaning it admits a certain kind of averaging that prevents paradoxical decompositions, while the group of rotations in 3-dimensional space is non-amenable, and this non-amenability is what makes the Banach-Tarski paradox possible. The fact that rotations in 3 dimensions can be combined in ways that allow pieces to be moved around and duplicated. The paradox raises questions about the relationship between mathematical objects and physical objects, because while the Banach-Tarski theorem is mathematically rigorous, it does not imply that a physical sphere can be duplicated. The decomposition involves infinitely complex sets, pieces that are not solid regions but scattered collections of points, with no smooth boundaries, and such pieces cannot be physically realized, cannot be cut or manipulated, and so the paradox is a feature of mathematical idealizations rather than a claim about physical reality. And this distinction is important. The paradox shows that mathematical spheres treated as sets of points behave in strange ways, but it does not threaten conservation of mass or energy in physics. Because physical objects are not sets of points but arrangements of atoms or fields or quantum states, and these are governed by physical laws that do not permit paradoxical duplication. Some mathematicians and philosophers argue that the Banach-Tarski paradox is not really a paradox but a theorem, a surprising result that reveals features of infinite point sets and non-measurable sets, and that calling it a paradox is misleading, suggesting contradiction when there is none, only counterintuitive behavior. And from this perspective, the paradox is valuable precisely because it challenges intuition, because it shows that infinite collections have properties that finite collections lack, that measure theory has limits, that the axiom of choice has strange consequences, and that mathematics is richer and stranger than naive expectations suggest. Others find the paradox troubling, a sign that something is wrong with the foundations, that the axiom of choice should be rejected or restricted, that non-measurable sets are pathological objects that should not be admitted into mathematics, and that theories which avoid such sets, like those based on constructive or intuitionistic logic, provide better foundations. And this debate reflects deeper disagreements about the nature of mathematical existence, about what kinds of objects mathematics should study, and about the role of intuition in guiding mathematical practice. The Banach-Tarski paradox also appears in discussions of probability and decision theory, because if a sphere can be decomposed into non-measurable pieces, then probability distributions on spheres must be carefully defined to avoid assigning probabilities to non-measurable sets. And this technical requirement reflects the same underlying issue, that not all collections of points can be measured, that probability requires measurability, and that attempting to assign probabilities to arbitrary sets leads to contradictions or paradoxes. The sphere sits on the table, solid and indivisible to the eye, but mathematically it is a set of infinitely many points. And the Banach-Tarski theorem says that these points can be partitioned into pieces, 5 or 6 strange scattered collections, and these pieces can be moved, rotated and translated and reassembled into 2 spheres, identical to the original, and the volume has doubled or seems to have doubled, but the pieces never had well-defined volumes. They were never measurable, and so nothing has been created, no conservation law has been violated, only the intuition that decomposition preserves size, and this intuition holds for finite decompositions, for measurable pieces, but fails for infinite non-measurable pieces, and the paradox endures, a theorem that sounds impossible, a result that challenges understanding, a demonstration that mathematics contains surprises, that infinity is stranger than imagination, that point sets behave in ways that solid objects do not, and that the axiom of choice, innocent as it seems, permits constructions that defy common sense, and the sphere duplicates, mathematically, if not physically. And the paradox remains a permanent fixture in the landscape of mathematics, a result that students encounter with disbelief, that mathematicians accept as rigorous yet counterintuitive, and that philosophers debate as revealing something deep about the nature of mathematical objects, about the limits of measure theory, about the relationship between infinite idealization and finite reality. And the sphere sits there, unchanged and yet somehow doubled, a monument to the strangeness of infinity, to the power of the axiom of choice, and to the capacity of mathematics to prove truths that seem like impossibilities. The Bell spaceship paradox: when 2 rockets pull a string apart, 2 identical spaceships float in space, separated by some distance, let us say 1 kilometer measured in their initial rest frame, and a thin thread connects the 2 ships, stretched taut but not under tension, and now both ships fire their rockets simultaneously, both accelerating at exactly the same rate, both reaching the same velocity at the same time as measured in the original rest frame. And the question arises, what happens to the thread? Does it break or does it remain intact? And the paradox is that two different lines of reasoning seem to give opposite answers. One argument says the thread remains intact because both ships accelerate identically and maintain constant separation in the original rest frame, while another argument says the thread must break because of length contraction, and this is Bell's spaceship paradox, proposed by physicist John Stuart Bell to clarify misconceptions about special relativity and the nature of length contraction. Consider the first argument. In the original rest frame, both ships start 1 kilometer apart, and both ships accelerate at the same rate, their velocities remaining equal at all times, and so the distance between them, as measured in the original rest frame, remains 1 kilometer throughout the acceleration. The ships maintain constant separation as measured by rulers at rest in the original frame, and the thread, stretched between the ships, also spans 1 kilometer in this frame. And if the separation does not change, then why would the thread break? It experiences no increased tension, no stretching, and so the thread should remain intact. And this reasoning seems compelling, seems to follow directly from the symmetry of the situation. But now consider the second argument, from the perspective of someone accelerating with the ships, someone in the instantaneous rest frame of the spaceships at any given moment. And in this frame, the distance between the ships is undergoing length contraction relative to the original frame. The proper distance between the ships, the distance measured by a ruler moving with the ships, is greater than 1 kilometer and growing because the ships are maintaining constant coordinate separation in the original frame, while length contraction says that moving objects are contracted, and so to maintain constant coordinate separation in the original frame, the proper separation must increase, must stretch, and the thread, a physical object with a rest length, cannot stretch indefinitely without breaking, and so the thread must snap as the proper distance between the ships increases beyond the thread's breaking point. Bell's answer, and the correct answer according to relativity, is that the thread breaks. The second argument is correct, and the error in the first argument is subtle. It confuses coordinate distance in the original rest frame with proper distance measured by moving rulers. And length contraction does not mean that objects physically shrink in their own rest frame. It means that the relationship between coordinate distance in one frame and proper distance in another frame involves a contraction factor, and when two ships maintain constant coordinate separation in the original frame while accelerating, they are actually increasing their proper separation, the distance measured by rulers that move with them, and the thread, stretched between the ships, experiences this increasing proper separation as tension, and eventually the tension exceeds the thread's strength and it breaks. Imagine the situation more concretely. Place a series of markers at rest in the original frame, spaced 1 meter apart, stretching from the first ship to the second ship. And initially, there are 1,000 markers spanning the 1 kilometer between the ships. And now, the ships accelerate, and at any given instant in the original frame, the ships remain at the same markers they started at. The distance between them measured by these markers remains 1,000 meters, but from the perspective of the moving ships, the markers are getting closer together, are contracting, because the markers are in motion relative to the ships, and so the ships see more and more markers passing between them. The number of markers spanning the gap increases, and this means the proper distance between the ships is increasing, and the thread, which has a fixed rest length, cannot span this increasing proper distance, and it breaks. The paradox reveals a common misconception about special relativity, the idea that if two objects start with a certain separation and undergo identical accelerations, then they must maintain the same separation, but this is false. Maintaining the same coordinate separation in one frame requires increasing proper separation when the objects are accelerating, and this is because acceleration is not relative in the way velocity is. Accelerating objects experience forces, have proper accelerations that can be measured by accelerometers on board, and two spaceships with identical proper accelerations do not maintain constant proper separation. They drift apart in their own instantaneous rest frames. Bell used this paradox to clarify that length contraction is a real physical effect, not merely a coordinate artifact or an optical illusion. The thread really breaks. Real physical forces are involved, and the contraction of moving objects is a consequence of how electromagnetic forces between atoms transform under Lorentz boosts. And these forces are what hold matter together, what give objects their rigidity, and when objects accelerate, the forces adjust. And in the Bell spaceship scenario, the adjustment causes the thread to experience tension and eventually to snap. The paradox also connects to the Ehrenfest paradox, another puzzle in special relativity involving rotation and length contraction, where a disk spinning at relativistic speeds seems to have a contracted circumference but unchanged radius, leading to apparent contradictions with Euclidean geometry. And both paradoxes illustrate that accelerated motion introduces subtleties that are not present in inertial motion, that naive applications of length contraction can lead to errors, and that careful analysis using the full machinery of special relativity is required to get the right answers. Visualize the two spaceships accelerating in lockstep, their separation constant as measured by observers at rest, but the thread between them stretching from the ship's perspective, growing taut, fibers straining and eventually snapping, breaking in the middle, the two halves trailing behind each ship, and the observers at rest see the thread break. Even though the ships never changed their coordinate separation, and this breaking is real, is frame independent, all observers agree that the thread broke. Though they may disagree about why, about what forces were involved, but the physical fact of the breaking is invariant, is an event in spacetime that everyone can observe. Bell's spaceship paradox remains a challenging problem in relativity pedagogy. Many students, and even some physicists, initially get it wrong, arguing that the thread should not break, and the paradox serves as a test of whether someone truly understands length contraction and the relativity of simultaneity, whether they can correctly apply these concepts to accelerating objects. And the paradox has generated extensive discussion in physics journals, with papers clarifying the resolution and exploring variations. And it stands as a reminder that special relativity, despite being over a century old, still contains subtleties that require careful thought, that intuitions about space and time must be constantly checked against the formalism, and that even seemingly simple scenarios can hide deep complexities. The rockets fire, the ships accelerate, maintaining constant spacing in the original frame, and the thread stretches, taut and straining, and then snaps, unable to bridge the growing proper distance. And Bell's paradox resolves, the thread breaks, relativity vindicated, and the lesson learned, that acceleration changes things, that maintaining coordinate separation requires increasing proper separation, that length contraction is real and physical, and that relativity continues to surprise, continues to challenge intuition, continues to reward careful analysis with deeper understanding of how space and time and motion interweave to create the strange but consistent fabric of relativistic physics. The Ellsberg paradox. An urn contains 90 balls, 30 of which are red, and 60 of which are some mix of black and yellow, but the exact proportions of black and yellow are unknown. The 60 non-red balls could be all black, all yellow, or any combination, and you are offered a series of bets, and the choices you face reveal a pattern of preferences that violates the standard axioms of rational decision theory. And this is the Ellsberg paradox, named after Daniel Ellsberg, who presented it in 1961. And the paradox demonstrates that people systematically prefer known probabilities to unknown probabilities, exhibiting what is called ambiguity aversion, a tendency to avoid situations where the probabilities are uncertain. And this preference pattern cannot be accommodated by expected utility theory, which requires that rational agents have well-defined subjective probabilities for all events and choose actions that maximize expected utility, calculated using these probabilities. The first bet involves choosing between two options. Bet A pays if a red ball is drawn, and bet B pays if a black ball is drawn. And most people prefer bet A, preferring to bet on red, where the probability is known to be 30 out of 90, 1/3, rather than betting on black, where the probability is unknown, could be anything from 0 to 60 out of 90. And this preference seems reasonable, seems to reflect a cautious attitude toward uncertainty, a desire to avoid ambiguity. The second bet offers a choice between bet C, which pays if a red or yellow ball is drawn, and bet D, which pays if a black or yellow ball is drawn, and most people prefer bet D, preferring to bet on black or yellow, where the combined probability is known to be 60 out of 90, 2/3, rather than betting on red or yellow, where the probability depends on the unknown proportion of yellow balls. The paradox emerges when these two preferences are combined, because preferring bet A to bet B suggests that the person believes red is more likely than black, that they implicitly assign a higher subjective probability to red, and preferring bet D to bet C suggests that they believe black or yellow is more likely than red or yellow, which implies that black is more likely than red. And these two beliefs are contradictory. If red is more likely than black, then red or yellow should be more likely than black or yellow, given that both involve adding the same unknown proportion of yellow. And so the preference pattern violates the sure thing principle, the axiom that if you prefer X to Y when some event E occurs, and you also prefer X to Y when E does not occur, then you should prefer X to Y unconditionally, regardless of whether you know whether E occurred. The Ellsberg paradox cannot be explained by standard subjective probability theory, because any consistent assignment of subjective probabilities to red, black, and yellow would make the preference for A over B incompatible with the preference for D over C. And so the pattern reveals that people do not have well-defined subjective probabilities for ambiguous events, or that they do not maximize expected utility using those probabilities, and instead they exhibit a preference for known over unknown probabilities, a violation of the completeness axiom of decision theory, which requires that agents must be able to compare all options and have a preference or be indifferent between them. Ellsberg's paradox has inspired alternative decision theories that can accommodate ambiguity aversion, including maximum expected utility theory, where agents consider multiple possible probability distributions consistent with their knowledge and choose the action that maximizes expected utility under the worst-case distribution, effectively being pessimistic about ambiguity, and Choquet expected utility theory, where probabilities are replaced with capacities that need not be additive, allowing for a richer representation of uncertainty, and multiple priors models, where agents maintain a set of probability distributions rather than a single prior, and use decision rules that reflect their attitudes toward this multiplicity. The paradox also connects to debates about rationality and the normative status of decision-theoretic axioms. Some argue that the Ellsberg preferences are irrational, that they reflect cognitive biases or errors in reasoning, and that ideal rational agents would not exhibit ambiguity aversion, would assign consistent subjective probabilities and maximize expected utility, while others argue that ambiguity aversion is perfectly rational, that it reflects a reasonable response to ignorance, that known risks are genuinely different from unknown risks, and that the axioms of expected utility theory, while mathematically elegant, do not capture all aspects of rational decision-making. The paradox has practical implications for economics and finance, because ambiguity aversion affects how people make decisions under uncertainty, how they invest in markets where probabilities are unknown, how they value insurance and options, how they respond to new technologies with uncertain risks. and understanding ambiguity, aversion, helps explain behaviours that seem puzzling from a standard expected utility perspective, such as the home bias in portfolio choice, where investors prefer domestic assets over foreign assets even when expected returns are higher abroad, and the equity premium puzzle, where the observed returns on stocks are much higher than on bonds, suggesting that investors demand large premiums for bearing ambiguous risks. The urn sits on the table, 90 balls inside, 30 red and 60 mixed, and you must choose, and the choices seem reasonable, seem to reflect a natural caution about the unknown, but the pattern of choices violates the axioms of rational decision theory, reveals a preference structure that cannot be represented by subjective probabilities, and the paradox forces a choice: either accept that the preferences are irrational and should be corrected, or accept that the theory is incomplete and should be extended, and neither option is comfortable. Neither satisfies the desire for a simple unified theory of rational choice. And so the Ellsberg paradox remains, a challenge to orthodoxy, a puzzle that resists easy resolution, a demonstration that human decision-making is more complex than the elegant mathematics of expected utility suggests. And the ambiguity persists. The unknown proportions of black and yellow remain unknown, and we choose as we must, preferring the known to the unknown, preferring certainty to ambiguity, and the theory struggles to accommodate this preference, struggles to explain why it should be rational or how it can be consistent, and the paradox endures, unsolved, unresolved, a permanent thorn in the side of decision theory. A reminder that rationality is contested, that formal models capture some aspects of decision-making but not all, and that the gap between theory and behaviour, between what axioms demand and what people do, may reflect not irrationality, but the inadequacy of the axioms themselves. And the urn waits, the balls wait, the choice waits, and we must decide, knowing some probabilities but not others. And the decision reveals something about us, about how we value knowledge and fear ignorance, about whether ambiguity is just another form of risk or something fundamentally different. And the paradox lingers, unresolved, unsettled, a puzzle that decision theory has not yet tamed. The diamond water paradox: why necessities are cheap and luxuries expensive. An economist observes that water is essential for life, is necessary for survival, is the most useful substance, and yet water is cheap, is almost free, costs nearly nothing in most places, while diamonds are useless for survival, are decorative luxuries, serve no biological function, and yet diamonds are expensive, cost fortunes, are among the most valuable commodities. And this seems paradoxical, seems to contradict the principle that value should reflect usefulness, that prices should correspond to importance. And this is the diamond water paradox, first discussed by Adam Smith, a puzzle about why necessities are cheap and luxuries expensive, why things essential for life have low prices while things irrelevant to survival have high prices. And the paradox challenged early economic thinking, challenged the labour theory of value, which said that prices reflect the amount of labour required to produce goods. And the paradox remained unresolved until marginal utility theory was developed, until economists realised that value depends not on total utility, but on marginal utility, not on the usefulness of the entire quantity available, but on the usefulness of one additional unit. And water has high total utility. Life depends on it, but low marginal utility because we have abundant water, and one more gallon provides little additional benefit, while diamonds have low total utility but high marginal utility because diamonds are scarce, and one more diamond provides significant additional satisfaction to those who value them. And this insight resolved the paradox, showed that prices reflect scarcity and marginal benefit rather than total importance. And the diamond water paradox became a teaching example, became the canonical illustration of the difference between total and marginal value. Imagine your situation regarding water. You have access to abundant water, can drink whenever you want, can shower, can water plants, and the first glass of water each day is enormously valuable. Prevents dehydration, sustains life. But by the time you've consumed several gallons, the marginal value of additional water is nearly zero. Additional water provides almost no benefit, and since price reflects the value of the marginal unit, the value of one more gallon, and since that marginal value is nearly zero, price is nearly zero, is very low, and this explains why water is cheap despite being essential. Because the marginal unit is not very valuable, because we have so much water that additional water is worth little. And now consider diamonds. You probably have no diamonds or very few, and the first diamond you acquire has significant value, provides aesthetic pleasure, provides status, and since diamonds are scarce, since you have few or none, the marginal value of an additional diamond is high. And since price reflects marginal value, price is high. And this explains why diamonds are expensive despite being non-essential. Because the marginal unit is very valuable. Because diamonds are scarce and additional, diamonds provide significant benefit to those who value them. The diamond water paradox demonstrates the importance of distinguishing total utility from marginal utility, shows that these can diverge dramatically, that goods with high total utility can have low marginal utility, and vice versa, and this distinction is fundamental to microeconomics, is the basis for understanding consumer choice, for deriving demand curves, for analysing how people allocate scarce resources, and marginal thinking about the value of additional units rather than the value of entire categories, is essential for economic reasoning. And the paradox illustrates why marginal thinking matters, why it produces different conclusions than total thinking, and resolving the paradox required economists to shift from thinking about total value to thinking about marginal value, to recognise that prices are determined at the margin, by the last unit exchanged, not by the average or total units. Visualise the marginal utility curves for water and diamonds. The marginal utility of water is high for the first units, the first gallons that prevent dehydration, but declines rapidly as consumption increases, as basic needs are satisfied, and at the quantity consumed, the marginal utility is low, is near zero, and price equals this low marginal utility, while the marginal utility of diamonds is high even at low quantities, because diamonds are scarce, because even wealthy people have relatively few diamonds, and at the quantity consumed the marginal utility remains high, and price equals this high marginal utility. And this graphical representation makes the resolution clear, makes it visible that prices reflect marginal, not total utility, and the paradox dissolves once the distinction is understood. One implication of the diamond water paradox is about consumer surplus, the difference between what consumers would be willing to pay for all units and what they actually pay. And consumer surplus for water is enormous, is the difference between the life-saving value of the first units and the near-zero price paid, and consumers gain vastly more from water than they pay for it. While consumer surplus for diamonds is small, buyers pay prices close to their willingness to pay, and this shows that market prices do not reflect total value to consumers, do not capture the full benefit people receive, and the difference is consumer surplus is the unmeasured benefit. And understanding this helps explain why markets are beneficial, why trade creates value, because both buyers and sellers typically gain surplus, gain benefit beyond what they pay or receive. Another implication concerns necessity goods and luxury goods more generally. The paradox illustrates that necessities tend to be cheap, tend to have low prices relative to their importance, because necessities are typically abundant or because demand saturates quickly, because once basic needs are satisfied, marginal utility declines, while luxuries tend to be expensive, tend to have high prices relative to their importance, because luxuries are scarce or because demand does not saturate, because the wealthy always want more luxuries, and this pattern has implications for taxation, for understanding that taxing necessities is regressive, hits the poor harder, while taxing luxuries is progressive, hits the wealthy harder, and the paradox helps explain why economists typically advocate luxury taxes over necessity taxes, why sin taxes on non-essential goods are more acceptable than food taxes. The paradox also appears in discussions about water scarcity because the resolution depends on water being abundant, depends on marginal utility being low, but in regions where water is scarce, the marginal utility of water rises dramatically, and prices should rise correspondingly, should reflect scarcity. And this suggests that in water-scarce regions, water should be expensive, should be priced to encourage conservation, to allocate scarce supplies efficiently, but such pricing is controversial, is seen as making a necessity unaffordable. And this creates political tension, creates conflict between economic efficiency, which requires high prices for scarce water, and social justice, which requires affordable water, and resolving this tension requires subsidies or tiered pricing or other interventions. And the paradox illuminates the trade-offs involved. Some argue that the diamond water paradox is not fully resolved, that even marginal utility theory leaves puzzles because why do diamonds have high marginal utility? Why do people value diamonds? And the answer involves signaling, involves conspicuous consumption, involves diamonds serving as status symbols. And this is a different kind of value, is social rather than intrinsic. And understanding diamond value requires understanding social dynamics, understanding how luxuries signal wealth, how scarcity creates desirability, and this extends the resolution, shows that marginal utility can reflect social as well as physical properties, can reflect symbolic meaning as well as functional use. The paradox also connects to debates about labor theory of value, because Marx used labor theory, argued that value reflects socially necessary labor time, and the diamond water paradox is often seen as refuting labor theory, as showing that prices do not simply reflect labor inputs, because water requires little labor per gallon, but is essential, while diamonds require more labor but are luxury. But defenders of labor theory respond that the paradox misunderstands their theory, that labor theory concerns exchange value, not use value, concerns prices, not total utility, and that labor theory can accommodate the paradox by recognizing that scarcity affects prices, that supply and demand matter, and this debate continues, shows that the paradox remains relevant for understanding competing theories of value. Water flows abundantly, is drunk freely, costs almost nothing, and diamonds sit in vaults, are purchased rarely, cost fortunes, and the paradox stands: necessity is cheap and luxury expensive. Total utility diverges from price, and the resolution comes through marginal thinking, through recognizing that prices reflect the value of additional units, not the value of all units, through understanding that scarcity matters, that abundance reduces marginal value, and the diamond water paradox endures as one of the classic examples in economics, as the teaching tool for introducing marginal utility, as the illustration of why economic thinking requires focusing on the margin, on incremental changes, on additional units, and the paradox remains resolved but instructive, showing that value is context-dependent, is determined by scarcity and marginal benefit, and prices reflect the margin, not the total, and understanding this is fundamental to economic reasoning. The crocodile dilemma, when a monster's promise makes truth deadly. A crocodile seizes a child from the riverbank, snatches the infant in its jaws, and the mother screams and begs for her child's return, and the crocodile, cunning and cruel, makes an offer. The crocodile says, "I will return your child if you correctly predict what I will do, if you say truly whether I will return the child or not." And the mother must choose, must predict the crocodile's action, and if she predicts correctly, she gets her child back. And if she predicts incorrectly, the crocodile keeps the child. And this seems straightforward at first, seems like a gamble with 50-50 odds. But the mother is clever, thinks carefully, and realizes she can construct a prediction that creates a paradox. and she says to the crocodile, "You will not return my child." And now the crocodile faces an impossible choice, a logical trap from which there is no escape. And this is the crocodile dilemma, an ancient paradox from Greek and Roman philosophy that illustrates how self-reference and promises can generate contradictions that have no resolution. Imagine the crocodile processing the mother's prediction. She has said, the crocodile will not return the child, and the crocodile must decide whether this prediction is true or false. And if the prediction is true, then the crocodile will not return the child, but the promise was to return the child. If the prediction is correct, and the prediction is correct, so the crocodile must return the child. But returning the child makes the prediction false, because the prediction said the child would not be returned. And if the prediction is false, then the crocodile is not obligated to return the child, but not returning the child makes the prediction true. And if it is true, the crocodile must return the child, and the cycle repeats. And the crocodile is stuck, unable to act, unable to fulfill the promise without violating it, unable to violate it without fulfilling it, and the paradox is complete. Visualize the crocodile frozen at the water's edge, jaws clamped around the child, mind caught in a logical loop, every option leading to contradiction, and the mother waits, and the crocodile cannot move forward or backward, cannot return the child or keep the child without creating impossibility. And the promise that seemed simple, seemed like a straightforward conditional, has become a trap, has revealed that some promises are unkeepable, some conditionals are incoherent when their conditions refer to their own fulfillment. The dilemma is structurally similar to the liar paradox, involves self-reference creating contradiction, because the mother's prediction refers to the crocodile's action, and the crocodile's action depends on whether the prediction is true, and the prediction's truth depends on the action. And this circular dependency creates a situation where no consistent assignment of truth values is possible, where any choice by the crocodile contradicts the conditions of the promise. And the paradox shows that not all promises can be kept, not all conditionals can be satisfied, especially when the condition refers to the action that depends on the condition. One proposed resolution is that the crocodile's promise is defective, is not a genuine promise, but a linguistic trick, because promises must be performable, must create obligations that can be fulfilled, and the crocodile's promise creates an obligation that cannot be fulfilled when the mother makes the strategic prediction, and so the promise is void. The crocodile is not bound by it, and the crocodile can do whatever it chooses without violating any obligation, and by this resolution, the crocodile keeps the child. The mother loses. Not because her prediction was wrong, but because she made a prediction that made the promise unenforceable, and the dilemma is resolved by rejecting the premise that the promise binds the crocodile in paradoxical cases. Another resolution distinguishes between the crocodile's intentions at the moment of making the promise and the actual outcome, and argues that the promise should be interpreted as concerning the crocodile's intended action, not the final action after considering the prediction, and when the mother predicts the child will not be returned, the crocodile evaluates whether to intend to return the child, and if the crocodile's initial intention is not to return the child, then the prediction is correct, and the crocodile should return the child according to the promise. And this return action does not create a contradiction, because the promise was about the intention, not about the final action. But this resolution seems strained, seems to reinterpret the promise in ways that were not clearly intended. And it is not obvious that distinguishing intention from action resolves the paradox or merely shifts it. A third resolution embraces the paradox and argues that it shows the limits of what can be promised, that some conditionals are inherently problematic, that promises whose conditions involve self-reference or depend on the promiser's response to the condition create logical tangles that cannot be resolved, and rational agents should avoid making such promises, should recognize that not every grammatically well-formed conditional statement creates a genuine obligation, and the crocodile's mistake was offering a promise whose structure allowed paradoxical predictions. And once the paradox emerges, the crocodile is released from the promise, is in a situation where any action is permissible because no action can satisfy the promise, and morality and logic give no guidance. The crocodile dilemma also illustrates issues in game theory and strategic reasoning, because the mother is using her prediction strategically, choosing her words not to convey her genuine belief about what the crocodile will do, but to create a situation where the crocodile cannot win. And this strategic use of language, using predictions not to predict, but to constrain, appears in negotiations, legal arguments, and political discourse, where statements are crafted to create binds, to force opponents into positions where any response is disadvantageous, and the dilemma shows that self-referential statements can be weapons, can be used to trap others in paradoxes where no good option exists. The dilemma has modern variants involving computers and artificial intelligence, where programs might be given instructions that are self-referential, that depend on the program's own output in ways that create paradox, and programmers must be careful to avoid such loops, must ensure that conditionals do not refer to their own evaluation in ways that create infinite regress or contradiction. And the crocodile dilemma serves as a warning, a reminder that self-reference is dangerous, creates problems that cannot always be resolved by cleverness or by trying harder, but only by recognizing the structure and avoiding it. The child hangs in the crocodile's jaws. The mother waits for an answer, and the crocodile is paralyzed by logic, cannot move without contradiction, and the ancient paradox remains, unsolved, unresolvable, a trap that philosophy has not escaped, a reminder that language can create impossibilities, that promises can be unkeepable, that self-reference generates paradoxes that defy solution, and the crocodile dilemma endures, taught in logic classes, discussed in philosophy seminars, a vivid example of how words can bind more tightly than chains, how a simple promise can become an impossible obligation, and how the combination of self-reference and conditionality creates contradictions from which there is no escape, and the crocodile remains frozen, the child unclaimed, and the paradox persists, waiting at the riverbank for the next clever victim to spring the trap. The bystander effect. Why more witnesses mean less help. A woman screams in the street, attacked by an assailant, stabbed repeatedly over the course of 30 minutes. And dozens of neighbours hear the screams, look out their windows, witness the attack, and no one calls police, no one intervenes, no one helps, and the woman dies while witnesses watch. And this is the murder of Kitty Genovese in 1964, an event that shocked the public, that seemed to reveal something disturbing about urban indifference, about human nature, and psychologists John Darley and Bib Latane investigated, conducted experiments to understand why bystanders fail to help, and their research revealed the bystander effect, the paradoxical finding that the presence of other witnesses decreases the likelihood that any individual will help, that the more people who witness an emergency, the less likely anyone is to intervene. And this contradicts common sense, which suggests that more witnesses mean more help, mean more potential helpers. But the psychological reality is opposite, is that responsibility diffuses across bystanders, that each assumes someone else will help. That pluralistic ignorance emerges where everyone looks to others to define the situation, and everyone concludes it must not be serious because no one else is acting, and the bystander effect reveals how social dynamics can produce collective inaction, can create situations where groups of people fail to help when any individual alone would help. And the effect has been replicated across hundreds of studies, has been demonstrated in contexts from emergencies to everyday helping, and understanding the bystander effect has practical implications for promoting helping behaviour, for overcoming diffusion of responsibility, for recognising that crowds do not guarantee help but often prevent it. Imagine witnessing an emergency, someone collapses on the sidewalk, and you are alone, and your responsibility is clear, is unambiguous, there is no one else who could help, and so you help, you call for medical assistance, you check if the person is breathing, you do what you can, and the situation is straightforward. Responsibility is concentrated, is entirely yours. But now imagine the same situation in a crowded plaza. Dozens of people are present, all witness the collapse, and now responsibility is diffused, is distributed across all present, and you reason that someone else will help, that someone with more expertise will intervene, that surely someone has already called for help, and you look to others to see how they are reacting, and they are not panicking, are not rushing to help, and so you conclude perhaps the situation is not serious, perhaps the person is drunk rather than injured, perhaps help is not needed, and everyone reasons this way. Everyone diffuses responsibility. Everyone looks to others and no one helps. And the person lies there untended while a crowd watches. And this is the bystander effect in action, the paradoxical result that more witnesses produce less help. The bystander effect demonstrates several psychological mechanisms: diffusion of responsibility, where the presence of others makes each individual feel less personally responsible; pluralistic ignorance, where everyone looks to others to define the situation, and everyone's inaction convinces everyone else that the situation is not serious; evaluation apprehension, where people fear being embarrassed if they help inappropriately, fear looking foolish if they misinterpret the situation; and audience inhibition, where the presence of others makes people self-conscious, makes them less willing to act. And these mechanisms combine to suppress helping behavior, to create barriers that are stronger when more people are present, and the effect is not universal, is moderated by various factors, by the ambiguity of the situation, by whether the victim and bystander are similar, by time pressure, by the relationship between bystanders, but the basic pattern is robust, is well established. More bystanders generally mean less help. Visualize the effect as an inverse relationship. As bystanders increase, helping probability decreases, and experiments show this quantitatively, show that when participants believe they are the only witness, they help more than 80% of the time. But when they believe there are 4 other witnesses, they help less than 40% of the time, and response time increases with number of bystanders. It takes longer to help when more are present, and these effects are not small, are not marginal, are dramatic reductions in helping behavior caused simply by the presence of others, and the effect challenges the assumption that safety in numbers applies to emergencies, shows that crowds can be dangerous not because they contain threats, but because they inhibit helping. One implication of the bystander effect is for personal safety, for recognizing that if you need help in an emergency, you should not appeal to groups, should not shout for someone to help, but should single out an individual, should point to a specific person and say, "You in the red shirt, call 911. And this direct assignment of responsibility overcomes diffusion, makes responsibility clear and concentrated, and significantly increases helping likelihood. And self-defense trainers teach this. Teach that calling for help requires specificity, requires breaking through the bystander effect by eliminating diffusion of responsibility. Another implication is for intervention training, for teaching people to recognize the bystander effect, to understand that their inaction contributes to collective inaction, that everyone assuming someone else will help means no one helps. An awareness of the effect increases helping behavior, increases intervention rates, and training programs that teach about the bystander effect and provide intervention skills show effectiveness, show that educated bystanders are more likely to help, are better at recognizing emergencies, are more willing to take responsibility, and many institutions now provide such training. Colleges offer bystander intervention programs. Workplaces train employees to intervene in harassment or discrimination, and understanding the psychology improves outcomes. The bystander effect also appears beyond emergencies, appears in everyday situations requiring minor helping, Someone drops papers and no one helps pick them up when many people are present. Someone struggles with a door and passers-by ignore them when others are around. And the effect generalizes, shows that diffusion of responsibility and pluralistic ignorance operate in low-stakes situations, not just in dramatic emergencies, and this suggests that the mechanisms are fundamental aspects of social psychology, are default responses to situations with potential helpers, and overcoming them requires conscious effort, requires recognizing the psychological barriers and deliberately choosing to help despite them. Some research questions the original Kitty Genovese narrative, suggests that the number of witnesses was exaggerated, that some witnesses did call police, that the story was sensationalized. And while the specific details are disputed, the bystander effect itself is real, is well documented, is not dependent on that one case, but is demonstrated across hundreds of experiments and real-world observations. And the effect remains one of the most robust findings in social psychology, remains a phenomenon that reliably occurs under controlled conditions. And questioning the Genovese case does not undermine the effect, does not invalidate the psychological mechanisms, but shows that public understanding of the case may be based on incomplete information. The effect also has limits, works differently in different cultures, is stronger in individualist cultures, and weaker in collectivist cultures, where group responsibility is more salient, is stronger in urban environments, and weaker in small communities where people know each other, is weaker when victims are similar to bystanders, when group identity is salient. And these moderators show that the effect is not inevitable, is not universal, but depends on social context, on cultural norms, on relationships. And this suggests intervention strategies, suggests that building community, creating shared identity, emphasizing collective responsibility can reduce the bystander effect, can promote helping even in groups. The woman lies in the street, bleeding, screaming, and windows light up. Faces appear, watch, and no one comes, no one calls. The witnesses assume others will help, assume the situation must not be serious if no one else is acting, and the bystander effect unfolds, responsibility diffuses, pluralistic ignorance emerges, and the woman dies while a crowd watches. And the tragedy reveals something about human psychology, reveals that helping is not automatic, is inhibited by social dynamics, is suppressed when others are present, and the bystander effect remains one of the most important findings in social psychology, remains a demonstration that individual helping decreases when groups are present, that crowds can be obstacles to help rather than sources of help. And understanding the effect is crucial for promoting intervention, for overcoming diffusion of responsibility, for ensuring that witnesses become helpers rather than passive observers. And the effect endures as a permanent warning about the social psychology of helping, about the paradox that more potential helpers often mean less actual help, and the lesson persists that helping requires overcoming social barriers, requires taking personal responsibility, despite the presence of others, requires acting when everyone else is watching and waiting. The Abilene paradox: why groups choose what nobody wants. A family sits on a porch in Coleman, Texas, on a hot afternoon, comfortable, playing dominoes, and the father-in-law suggests driving to Abilene for dinner, 53 miles away in a car without air conditioning. And the suggestion is not enthusiastic, is tentative, but the son-in-law says sure, sounds good, not because he wants to go, but because he assumes others want to go, and he wants to be agreeable. And the wife says yes if you all want to go, and the mother-in-law says of course, and they all pile into the car and drive to Abilene in dusty heat, arrive hot and tired, eat mediocre food, drive back exhausted, and sitting on the porch again, someone admits they didn't really want to go, and then everyone admits they didn't want to go, admits they only agreed because they thought others wanted it, and the entire group took an action that no individual wanted, chose an outcome that everyone preferred to avoid. And this is the Abilene paradox, described by management professor Jerry Harvey, a phenomenon where groups make decisions that contradict the preferences of all members, where collective action diverges from individual preferences, not through majority rule or compromise, but through misperception, through failure to communicate, through assumptions about what others want. And the paradox reveals that agreement is not always consensus, that unanimous decisions can be unwanted by everyone. And the Abilene paradox shows a different kind of collective irrationality from Condorcet cycles or voting paradoxes. Shows irrationality that arises from social dynamics, from conformity pressure, from reluctance to dissent. And the paradox remains relevant for understanding group decision-making, for recognizing that groups can fail not just through conflict, but through false consensus, through everyone going along with what nobody wants. Imagine the psychology of each family member. Each sits on the porch comfortable, each prefers staying home. But each hears the suggestion and thinks, well, if someone is suggesting it, they must want it. I don't want to be the one who ruins everyone's plans. I should be agreeable. Go along, be a team player. And so each agrees despite preferring to stay. And no one voices their actual preference. No one says, I'd rather stay home. And the group collectively creates a false impression, creates the appearance of consensus when none exists, and everyone interprets others' agreement as reflecting genuine preference rather than social accommodation. And this mutual misperception drives the group toward an outcome no one wants. And the paradox unfolds. The trip is taken, the unwanted dinner eaten, and only afterward does truth emerge. Does communication clarify that everyone preferred staying home? And the group confronts the absurdity, the recognition that they did something no one wanted through failure to communicate authentically. The Abilene paradox differs from groupthink, where group members genuinely conform their preferences to the group, genuinely come to believe the group view. And Abilene involves no genuine preference change, involves only misperception, only assumption about what others want. And members maintain their private preferences, but suppress them out of social pressure, out of desire to be agreeable. And this suppression is the source of the paradox, creates the gap between public agreement and private preference, and the gap allows groups to pursue actions that everyone opposes. And breaking the paradox requires someone to voice dissent, to say, actually, I'd prefer not to go. And this dissent can reveal that others feel the same, can break the false consensus, but dissent is risky, is socially uncomfortable, requires challenging what appears to be group preference. And most people avoid this, prefer to go along, and the paradox persists. Visualize the Abilene paradox as a coordination failure, where the optimal outcome requires everyone to reveal their true preferences, requires honest communication, but social norms and psychological tendencies prevent this, create pressure toward agreement, toward accommodation, toward not rocking the boat. And these pressures are strongest when relationships matter, when group harmony is valued, when dissent risks social costs and family dinners and work teams and community groups all face Abilene risks. All can make decisions that no one wants, through false consensus, through failure to communicate authentically. And the paradox shows that agreement is not always good, that unanimous decisions can be wrong, that groups need mechanisms for authentic communication, need cultures that encourage dissent, need permission to disagree. One lesson from the Abilene paradox is the importance of honest communication, of creating environments where people feel safe expressing disagreement, where dissent is welcomed rather than punished. And organizations that suffer repeated Abilene paradoxes often have cultures of false harmony, have norms that discourage challenging proposals, have leaders who interpret dissent as disloyalty, and these cultures create conditions for Abilene, create pressure toward agreement, and preventing the paradox requires changing culture, requires valuing truth over harmony, requires encouraging people to voice concerns. And this is difficult, requires conscious effort, requires leadership that models disagreement, that rewards dissent, that avoids shooting messengers. Another lesson is about decision-making procedures, about how groups can avoid Abilene through structured processes, through anonymous voting, through devil's advocate roles, through explicit checking for consensus, through asking not just who agrees, but who disagrees and why. And these procedures create space for dissent, create permission to voice opposition, and reduce pressure toward false consensus. And effective groups use these procedures systematically, build them into decision-making, recognize that surface agreement may hide opposition, and these procedures are especially important for high-stakes decisions, for commitments that are costly to reverse. And the trip to Abilene is costly, is unpleasant for everyone, and could have been avoided with better communication. The Abilene paradox also appears in organizational settings, in corporations where teams pursue strategies that no one really supports, in committees that adopt policies no member wants, in groups that invest in projects everyone privately doubts. And these organizational Abilenes are costly, waste resources, damage morale, produce outcomes that serve no one's interests. And preventing them requires organizational awareness, requires training people to recognize Abilene dynamics, requires creating cultures where speaking up is safe, where dissent is valued, and many organizations fail at this. Have cultures of deference, have hierarchies, where subordinates agree with superiors even when privately opposed. And these cultures are Abilene-prone, create repeated paradoxes, and organizational effectiveness requires breaking these patterns. Some argue that the Abilene paradox is overstated, that genuine cases are rare, that most group decisions reflect genuine preferences of at least some members, and while everyone agreeing despite everyone opposing is uncommon, partial Abilene is more common, where some members oppose but remain silent, and the group pursues a course that a vocal minority supports while a silent majority opposes, and this partial Abilene is still problematic, still produces suboptimal outcomes, and preventing it still requires encouraging dissent, requires creating safety for opposition. The paradox also raises questions about responsibility, about who is responsible when groups make decisions no one wants. And the answer is everyone and no one. Everyone contributed through silence, through false agreement, through failure to voice opposition, but no one individually caused the outcome. No one individually chose wrongly. Each made a reasonable social decision to accommodate perceived group preferences. And the collective outcome is worse than any individual action merited. And this shows how social dynamics can produce results that exceed individual culpability, can create group failures that no individual intended. And avoiding such failures requires collective awareness, requires group-level solutions, requires changing communication patterns and decision procedures. The family sits on the porch afterward, hot and tired and annoyed, and someone admits they didn't want to go, and the admissions cascade. And everyone realizes the absurdity, realizes they collectively did something no one wanted, and the Abilene paradox is revealed, and laughter mixes with frustration, and the lesson is learned. The importance of honest communication, the danger of false consensus, the need to voice dissent, and the paradox remains a permanent reminder that groups can fail not just through conflict, but through excessive agreeableness, through mistaken assumptions about others' preferences, through social pressures that suppress authentic communication, and the Abilene paradox endures as a cautionary tale about group decision-making, a demonstration that agreement is not always consensus, that unanimous decisions can be wrong, and that preventing collective irrationality requires creating environments where dissent is safe, where truth is valued over harmony, and where groups communicate authentically rather than accommodating falsely. Schrödinger's cat, the pet that's both alive and dead. A cat sits in a sealed box, a box that cannot be opened or observed from the outside. And inside the box with the cat is a device, a quantum mechanism that has a 50% chance of killing the cat within 1 hour and a 50% chance of leaving the cat alive. perhaps a vial of poison that will break if a single radioactive atom decays. And the decay is a quantum event, genuinely random, with no way to predict whether it will happen in the next hour. And so after 1 hour has passed, the cat is either alive or dead. 50-50 odds. And this seems straightforward, but the paradox emerges when quantum mechanics is taken seriously, when the rules of quantum theory are applied consistently, because quantum mechanics says that before a measurement is made, before the box is opened and the cat is observed, the system exists in a superposition, a combination of both possible states simultaneously. And so the cat is both alive and dead at the same time, existing in a strange limbo where neither state is definite until observation collapses. The superposition and forces the system into one state or the other. And this is Schrödinger's cat, a thought experiment devised by physicist Erwin Schrödinger in 1935 to illustrate what he saw as the absurdity of applying quantum mechanics to macroscopic objects to show that something was wrong with the standard interpretation of quantum theory. Imagine the situation step by step. At the beginning, the cat is alive, the radioactive atom has not yet decayed, and the quantum state is well defined. But as time passes, the atom enters a superposition of decayed and not decayed, because quantum mechanics describes it with a wave function that assigns amplitudes to both possibilities, and these amplitudes evolve smoothly, and the atom is in a state of quantum indeterminacy, neither definitely decayed nor definitely not decayed until a measurement is made. And this indeterminacy is not ignorance, not a matter of the atom being in one state or the other, and we just do not know which, but a genuine feature of quantum reality. The atom literally does not have a definite state until measured. And because the poison release is coupled to the atom's state, the poison is both released and not released. And the cat is both dead and alive, existing in a superposition of macroscopic states. And this conclusion seems absurd, seems to violate everything we know about cats and boxes and life and death, and Schrödinger intended it to be absurd, to show that something must be wrong with the orthodox interpretation of quantum mechanics, that the theory cannot be applied consistently to large objects, that there must be a boundary somewhere between the quantum realm, where superpositions occur, and the classical realm, where objects have definite states. The paradox has generated an enormous amount of discussion and debate in physics and philosophy, with different interpretations of quantum mechanics offering different resolutions. The Copenhagen interpretation, the dominant view in Schrödinger's time, says that the wave function collapses upon measurement, that the act of observation forces the system into one definite state. And so when the box is opened and the cat is observed, the superposition collapses and the cat becomes definitely alive or definitely dead. But this raises questions about what counts as a measurement, about what constitutes an observer, about whether consciousness is required to collapse the wave function, or whether any physical interaction suffices. And these questions remain controversial, and the Copenhagen interpretation does not provide clear answers, does not specify where the quantum classical boundary lies. The many worlds interpretation offers a different resolution, saying that the wave function never collapses, that both outcomes occur, that the universe splits into two branches, one where the cat is alive and one where the cat is dead, and both branches are equally real. And the observer also splits, becoming two versions, one observing a live cat and one observing a dead cat. And each version believes they have observed a definite outcome. But from a global perspective, both outcomes happen. And the superposition is resolved not by collapse but by branching. And this interpretation avoids the measurement problem, avoids the need to specify what counts as a measurement. But it introduces other difficulties. The proliferation of parallel worlds, the question of what it means for both outcomes to be real, and whether this is a genuine solution or merely a reformulation of the problem. Decoherence theory provides another perspective, focusing on the interaction between the quantum system and its environment, and it shows that macroscopic objects, like cats, are constantly interacting with their surroundings, with air molecules, with photons, with thermal radiation, and these interactions cause the quantum coherence, the delicate phase relationships that allow superpositions to be destroyed very rapidly in a fraction of a second for macroscopic objects. And once coherence is lost, the system behaves classically, appears to be in one definite state, and so the cat never actually exists in a superposition of alive and dead, or exists in such a state for only an immeasurably short time before decoherence converts it to a classical mixture, a probabilistic state where the cat is either alive or dead. We just do not know which until we look. And this dissolves the paradox by denying that macroscopic superpositions persist long enough to be observable. The paradox also raises questions about the role of consciousness in quantum mechanics, about whether an observer must be conscious to collapse the wave function, and some interpretations suggest that consciousness plays a special role, that the cat remains in superposition until a conscious being opens the box and perceives the outcome. And this view has been criticized as mystical, as importing mind into physics in ways that are unnecessary and unhelpful, and most physicists reject it, preferring interpretations that treat measurement as a physical process involving interactions with macroscopic devices not requiring consciousness. But the question remains open, debated, unresolved, and Schrödinger's cat sits at the center of this debate, a symbol of the deep puzzles that quantum mechanics presents. Visualize the box, sealed and opaque, and inside the cat waits, and the quantum device ticks, and the atom hovers in superposition. And according to quantum mechanics, the entire contents of the box, the atom, the device, the poison, the cat, all exist in a superposition of two macroscopically distinct states: alive cat no decay and dead cat decay. And this superposition is described by a wave function that smoothly evolves, and the two branches of the wave function correspond to two different realities. And yet before the box is opened, there is only one box, one cat, one system. And the paradox is that quantum mechanics seems to say the cat is both alive and dead. While common sense says the cat is either alive or dead, we just do not know which, and this clash between quantum formalism and classical intuition is the heart of Schrödinger's cat, a paradox that has no agreed-upon solution, that different interpretations resolve in different ways, and that continues to drive research in the foundations of quantum mechanics. In efforts to understand what measurement means, what quantum states represent, and how the quantum world relates to the classical world we experience, the box sits on the table, the hour passes, and the cat's fate is sealed. Or is it? Or is the cat in limbo, suspended between life and death, waiting for observation to make reality definite? And the paradox endures, not because physicists do not understand quantum mechanics, but because quantum mechanics, understood correctly, leads to conclusions that seem impossible, that violate everyday experience, that force choices between interpretations that are empirically equivalent but conceptually divergent. And Schrödinger's cat remains the most famous illustration of this strangeness, a thought experiment that has entered popular culture, a paradox that symbolizes the weirdness of quantum reality. And the cat, alive and dead, real and hypothetical, continues to haunt physics and philosophy, a permanent reminder that the quantum world is not merely different in degree from the classical world, but different in kind, governed by rules that defy visualization and resist intuitive understanding. And the paradox persists, unresolved in the deepest sense, a puzzle that reveals the limits of human intuition and the challenge of making sense of a theory that works perfectly in practice but remains mysterious in principle.